on the quiet evening of June 5, 2021, in the serene community of Lake Tahoe, California. Everything was calm and blissful, and neighbors went about their business like every other day. But then, out of nowhere, and without warning, the peace was shattered in the most brutal way. A masked man, who was armed with weapons, slipped into the home of an elderly couple. For nearly 3 hours, he lingered in the shadows, waiting, plotting, and listening to the unsuspecting family inside. His mission was simple and horrifying. He wasn't there to rob the couple. He wasn't there to scare them either. He was there to kill them. Robert Spohr and Wendy Wood, the elderly couple who were both in their 70s and were well loved in their community, was his target. And he was determined to gun them down. After waiting for hours, the masked man eventually made his move. He opened fire, and the 70-year-old Robert Spohr was gunned down, his life ending instantly. The old man's wife, Wendy Wood, was also shot twice in the head, but she miraculously survived, clinging to life but scarred forever. 2 small grandchildren slept in the house that night, blissfully unaware that death had walked their halls. Police were called immediately after the shooting, and detectives scrambled to piece together what had happened. At first, the scene suggested a random act of brutality. Everyone thought that a burglar had come to steal from the couple before killing them. However, as evidence emerged, the security cameras told a different story, and the mask was ripped away. It was discovered that the man who had brought death into that peaceful Lake Tahoe home was no stranger at all. He was not a faceless criminal lurking in the shadows. It wasn't a drifter or a burglar. It was someone that the elderly couple knew. He was, in fact, a family member, and someone that the world once cheered for on the pitcher's mound. He was someone who had once been admired by thousands, cheered for his arm on the baseball mound, celebrated under stadium lights. His name was Dan Serafini, a former Major League Baseball star pitcher. This was a man who had tasted wealth, fame, and opportunity, a man who was hailed as a hero by many. When his name was mentioned as a suspect in the shooting, everyone was shocked. It seemed impossible, unheard of. Dan Serafini didn't look like the kind of man who could hurt a fly, let alone kill another man. The case got national attention, and many wondered what could have driven Dan to commit such an act. But what happened to Dan Serafini? How does a man who once wore the uniform of the Minnesota Twins and the Chicago Cubs end up sneaking through the back door of his in-laws' home, gun in hand, driven by desperation and rage? Tonight, we unravel the story of his rise, his fall, and the night he chose to cross the point of no return. Long before his name became tied to crime and tragedy, Daniel Joseph Serafini was a boy with a dream. Born in San Mateo, California, in 1974, Dan grew up in a modest household where baseball was more than just a pastime. It was a passion. Like countless American kids, he spent endless afternoons on dusty diamonds, throwing until his arm ached, dreaming of the big leagues. From childhood, it was already Dan's dream to play baseball, and he was determined to achieve his dreams. By the time he got to high school, it was clear he wasn't just another kid with a glove. Scouts noticed his left-handed arm, which was rare, powerful, and promising. Everyone could see that he had control, speed, and a stubborn competitiveness. Everything he did with a ball caught attention. In 1992, his dream took shape when the Minnesota Twins drafted him in the first round, the 26th overall pick. For a boy just 18, the world suddenly opened up. By signing that first contract, Dan knew he had made it. He knew his dream had come to fruition, and he was ecstatic. This wasn't just about validation for him. It was also about escape. escape from his mediocre life to a life of abundance and destiny. For his family, it meant financial hope. For Dan, it meant stepping into a new identity. He was not just Daniel Serafini anymore, but the Twins' newest pitcher, the kind of young man destined to carve his place on the mound. His minor league years were filled with grit and learning curves. From bus rides across the country to late nights studying hitters, he poured himself into the game. Coaches described him as cocky at times, confident always, but undeniably talented. By 1996, he made his debut in Major League Baseball. Under the bright stadium lights, wearing the Twins uniform, he stood on the mound with the roar of thousands behind him. The roar of the crowd felt like magic for him. Anytime he stepped into the stadium and onto the pitch, he felt alive. For a young man barely in his 20s, this was everything he had ever wanted. He was living the dream, facing down some of the best hitters in the world, making a name for himself as a left-handed pitcher who could deliver under pressure. Over the years, Dan Serafini bounced between teams, including the Cubs, the Padres, the Pirates, and the Reds. Journeyman pitchers like him often live on the margins, traded or signed when needed, cut when they struggle. But the paychecks were real. Even as a mid-level player, salaries in the late 90s and early 2000s reached into the hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions. For a kid who'd once lived modestly, the money felt endless. Dan felt like the money he was making was like a pouring rain. He had never seen that kind of money before, and he lived his life as he pleased. He bought whatever he wanted, lived the life of his dreams, and had countless friends who were always by his side. He also made sure his family was well off with the money he made. Everything seemed perfect. Dan was living his dreams. It was around this time that Dan met Renee, the woman who would later become his wife. They crossed paths during his playing career, and for Dan, she represented stability, a partner who understood his highs and lows. However, things would later fall apart for them, and they filed for divorce. The divorce was quite messy, and it affected him a bit. It is also important to note that while he was still married to Renee, Dan met and fell in love with another woman called Erin. Dan and Erin were introduced after Erin was hired to work with Dan's first wife Renee and help train her horses. Dan and Erin soon started seeing each other and became practically inseparable. During Dan's messy divorce from Renee, Erin became his succor and go-to person for comfort. As a matter of fact, our findings show that Erin and Dan got married just 2 days after Renee filed for divorce. They were determined to make things work for them. For the record, Erin came from a well-to-do family. Her parents were Robert Spohr and Wendy Wood, who were very rich and highly respected in their Lake Tahoe community. They were welcoming and supportive of Dan, and proud to see their daughter build a life with a man who had climbed to the top of professional sports. By all appearances, life was awesome. They had the picture-perfect family. They also had the backing of Erin's supportive parents, and the kind of lifestyle most people envy. But the world of professional sports is fickle, and the career that had once put money in Dan's pocket began to fade. By the mid-2000s, Dan's time in the MLB was drawing to a close. His stats declined, his velocity dipped, and teams were less interested in signing him. Desperate to stay in the game, he went overseas, pitching in Japan for the Chiba Lotte Marines. While in Japan, he also tasted both promise and disappointment. Though the pay was respectable, about hundreds of thousands per season, it was a huge step down from the glory of the majors. Dan later returned to Major League Baseball in the United States on July 31st, 2007, and signed a minor league contract with the Colorado Rockies. However, in November 2007, Major League Baseball suspended Dan for 50 games after he tested positive for a performance-enhancing substance in violation of the league's Joint Drug Prevention and Treatment Program. This was a huge setback for Dan, and it dealt a really crushing blow to his already fading star. He soon left the United States to play in the Mexican League. Dan Serafini spent the 2008 and 2009 seasons with the Sultanas de Monterrey in the Mexican League. By the year 2012, his playing days were effectively over. Dan knew he had to retire from the sport, and this was exactly what he did. For some athletes, retirement is just another chapter. For Dan, it was the beginning of the end. The transition from professional athlete to everyday man is brutal. Imagine being in your late 30s, but in the only career you've ever known. You're already considered washed up. The millions you earned, if not wisely managed, can vanish fast. And for Dan, the money slipped through his fingers very fast. After the roar of stadium crowds faded and the baseball checks stopped coming in, Dan Serafini began to look for a new chapter. He and his wife, Erin, decided to go into business. After searching for what to do for a while, the couple thought they had found their answer in Sparks, Nevada. Together, they purchased a neighborhood bar, a sports-themed hangout that they named the Bullpen Bar, later rebranded as the Oak Tavern. On the surface, it was a natural fit. A former major league pitcher running a bar built around the camaraderie of sports, with walls decorated in memorabilia and the promise of loyal local patrons. It was supposed to be their big comeback, their way of building something lasting beyond baseball. But almost from the beginning, cracks started to show in their bar business. Managing a bar was nothing like managing a pitching rotation, and soon, the couple started recording losses. The bills piled up, their staff morale dipped, and patrons complained bitterly. By 2015, the bar had become such a disaster that it caught the attention of reality TV producers. On June 28, 2015, the Serafinis and their struggling bar were featured on an episode of Bar Rescue, the popular show where the host, John Taffer, swoops in to try and fix failing businesses. The episode pulled back the curtain, showing viewers an unfiltered look at the chaos in Dan's life, including the financial strain he was facing, the poor management of his bar, and the emotional toll of watching a dream slip away from him and his wife. Millions saw Dan, not as the confident left-handed pitcher of his MLB days, but as a former athlete grappling with failure in real time. The show host, John Taffer, tried to help the couple. Dan and Erin's Bullpen Bar was rebranded as the Oak Tavern, complete with a facelift, a new concept, and renewed hope. For a brief moment, it looked like Dan and Erin might turn things around. But the optimism didn't last. The bar eventually folded, closing its doors for good. What was supposed to be a fresh start became another painful chapter. For Dan, it wasn't just a business failure. It was a public humiliation and unraveling. He felt like a failure, a man who could not keep a business running. The worst part was that his failure to successfully run his bar was broadcast on national television, showing the world that the man who once stood tall on the pitcher's mound was now struggling to keep his own life together. He was gutted by the entire thing. This failure was more than financial for Dan. It was a dent on his pride. It also deepened the strain on his marriage to Erin, because it added to the financial spiral they were already battling with. Because of this, they were forced to lean more heavily on Erin's family for support. Each step downwards, from the collapse of his career to the collapse of the bar, brought Dan closer to a dangerous breaking point, one that no one could have predicted would end in bloodshed. Dan is said to have invested in other businesses that floundered, made risky financial moves that didn't work out, and struggled to find his footing outside the sport. Unlike the stadiums that once cheered his name, real life offered no applause, no contracts, no adoring fans. Just bills, responsibility, and the growing pressure of family life. In the heat of the financial crisis that Dan and Erin were facing, Erin's rich parents, Robert Spohr and Wendy Wood, stepped in. They supported the couple financially, helping them stay afloat as Dan's ventures failed. Aaron's parents gave Dan huge loans and other financial help to assist him and his wife in getting back on their feet. At first, it may have felt like generosity, but over time, Dan's dependence on his in-laws began to fester inside him. He felt useless sometimes, and his pride began to clash with reality. Here was a man who had once been a professional athlete, now leaning heavily on his wife's family to survive. He felt powerless. The more Robert and Wendy provided, the more Dan seemed to resent them. He felt like he wasn't just borrowing money, he was also borrowing dignity. And every reminder of their generosity was a reminder of his failure. By the late 2010s, Dan Serafini was no longer just struggling, he was desperate. He had cycled through failed businesses, mounting debt, and a reputation as a man who couldn't stand on his own 2 feet. Aaron's parents remained generous, but generosity has limits, and those limits were fast approaching. Tension grew in the Dan household. Arguments escalated frequently, and behind closed doors, resentment turned to rage. Dan felt trapped by his past glory, trapped by his failures, and trapped in the shadow of in-laws who seemed to have more control over his family than he did. And then, at some point, in that storm of bitterness, the unthinkable thought began to take root in Dan's mind. He began to think that if his rich in-laws, Robert and Wendy, were gone, things would be easier. Their financial ties, their judgment, and their presence would be erased. And if they were dead, the inheritance they would leave for their daughter, Aaron, in their will become his own to use as he please. It's one thing to think it, it's another to act on it. But in Dan Serafini's mind, the descent had already begun. June 5th, 2021. Lake Tahoe, the home of Robert and Wendy, should have been a sanctuary. A place where grandchildren laughed, where the couple enjoyed the fruits of their long lives. But instead, it became the scene of calculated violence. That evening, a masked intruder, armed with a gun and prepared, broke into the elderly couple's home. For hours he lingered. Imagine the stillness of those walls, the faint sound of children breathing upstairs, the ticking of clocks as a predator waited in the shadows. And then suddenly, the assailant launched his attack and opened fire. As the shots rang out, Aaron's father, Robert Spohr, was struck and killed instantly. His wife, Wendy Wood, was also shot twice in the head and left for dead, her body crumpling under the weight of violence she never saw coming. Miraculously, she survived, but her life would never be the same. The police were called immediately after the shooting. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the Lake Tahoe home that night, they were met with a scene that felt both chaotic and frozen in time. The body of Aaron's father, Robert Spohr, lay crumpled in the living room. A single shot to the head had ended his life instantly. His wife, Wendy, was still alive, but barely breathing. 2 bullets had torn into her skull, yet she clung to breath, miraculously defying the killer's intent. In another part of the house, 2 small grandchildren remained asleep, blissfully unaware that death had moved through their halls. Detectives went to work immediately to get to the bottom of the case and unveil the killer. The first question for the detectives was obvious. Who would want to kill this elderly couple? Robert Spohr and Wendy Wood were not the kind of people one expected to be targets of murder. Robert was already in his 70s, retired, and a respected member of his community. Wendy was also in her 70s and a grandmother who still played piano and sang with her grandchildren. Their lives were simple and rooted in family. They were not known to be embroiled in disputes, debts, or rivalries. They were loved by many people in their community, so who could have wanted them dead? On the surface, they were ordinary victims. But detectives knew better. In true crime, there are no random executions. Their house showed no signs of forced entry. Detectives could see that there were no shattered windows, no broken locks. Nothing was missing. No jewelry, no wallets, no electronics had gone missing. So this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was personal. Someone had come into that house not for things, but for blood. And then there was the detail that chilled investigators the most. The shooter had waited for the couple for some time before opening fire. Surveillance cameras captured a hooded man lingering outside the home for nearly 3 hours before the first shot was fired. For those 3 hours, he was pacing, crouching, and watching. That kind of patience spoke of deep intent. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just killing. He was hunting. Detectives began digging into the Spohr's family. Who might benefit from their deaths? Who held grudges against them? Slowly, a name surfaced. Detectives soon realized that one man had both proximity to the couple and reason to resent them. That man was their son-in-law, Dan Serafini. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Dan was no ordinary son-in-law. He had once been a professional athlete, a pitcher in Major League Baseball. He had worn the uniforms of the Minnesota Twins, the Chicago Cubs, and the San Diego Padres. This was a man who had earned millions under stadium lights, cheered by thousands. The kind of man kids once asked for autographs from. How could such a man do something like this? Could Dan now be reduced to skulking in the shadows of his in-laws' home? Pulling a trigger on a 70-year-old man? Even though it sounded quite absurd, detectives didn't rule out Dan's involvement. Investigators continued to piece together the crime scene. They combed through surveillance footage, analyzed shell casings, tracked phone records, and slowly, connections began to emerge. The hooded figure caught on camera the night of the shooting matched the build of a man they already suspected, Dan Serafini. Further investigation revealed troubling evidence: searches, financial ties, strained relationships, and whispers of marital discord. Then came the bombshell. Dan Serafini wasn't alone. Evidence pointed to an accomplice who had helped him commit the crime. That accomplice was his wife's close friend, Samantha Scott. Together, the two had allegedly plotted the attack on Robert Spohr and Wendy Wood. For months, detectives built their case quietly. They traced movements, followed money trails, and compared DNA. Every breadcrumb pointed back to Dan Serafini and Samantha Scott. In October 2023, more than 2 years after the murders, authorities finally moved in to make arrests. Dan Serafini was arrested in Nevada, and Samantha Scott was picked up in Las Vegas. The arrests shocked those who once remembered Dan not as a killer, but as the man on the mound in a Cubs jersey. But what was the motive for the murder? Investigators painted it in stark, devastating strokes. They explained that money, resentment, and the slow corrosion of pride were what led Dan to commit the crime. They explained that Dan Serafini had depended on his in-laws for years. But the financial support had its limits. Perhaps the Spohrs had begun to draw boundaries. Perhaps they demanded repayment. Perhaps they simply grew weary of carrying him. Whatever the trigger, Dan saw them not as family but as obstacles. In his twisted calculation, removing them meant removing the problem. And so, on that summer night in 2021, the former Major League pitcher crouched outside their home for 3 long hours, waiting for the courage or the cruelty to strike. When he finally pulled the trigger, he shattered not just the lives of Robert and Wendy, but his own, his family's, and the legacy of a career once filled with promise. The case against him was built piece by piece. Surveillance footage placed him at the scene. Forensic evidence tied him to the weapon. Witnesses confirmed his bitterness and dependency on the Spohrs. Phone records painted a damning timeline. And then there was Wendy herself. Though she took her own life 1 year later due to the trauma, she had survived long enough to tell investigators what little she remembered. The shooter was someone they knew. Wendy told authorities she was sure that it was Dan who committed the act. That statement alone sent investigators down the path that led to Dan Serafini. As his mugshot flashed across news stations, the contrast was impossible to ignore. This was no longer the clean-cut athlete in pinstripes, staring down batters with steely focus. This was a middle-aged man, eyes hollow, face hardened, accused of orchestrating the cold-blooded murder of the very people who had once supported him. On October 20th, 2023, Dan was charged with the murder of his father-in-law and attempted murder of his mother-in-law. When the case went to court, the trial was explosive. Prosecutors laid out the financial desperation, the simmering resentments, and the meticulous planning. They showed the footage of the hooded man pacing outside the Spohr's home, the shell casings, the phone records, the accomplice's role. They asked the jury to see not a fallen athlete, but a killer driven by greed and pride. On July 14th, 2025, Dan Serafini was found guilty of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and first-degree burglary. On her part, Samantha Scott pled guilty to being an accessory after the fact. She was released until sentencing and is facing up to 3 years in prison. Dan has not yet been sentenced, but it is expected that he would be spending life in prison. Dan Serafini, once a name called out in stadiums, once a man who stood under the lights, now sits in a cell, awaiting judgment not from fans or coaches, but from a court of law. This is the story of how pride, desperation, and greed turned a former athlete into a murderer. It is the story of a crime that began in the shadows of Lake Tahoe and ended with the unmasking of a man who had already lost everything, but still thought he had something left to take. It is the story of Dan Serafini. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like to help this channel out, and please subscribe to see more videos like this every week. Thank you.